Think about that for a moment. As long as life remains a theater where you are only the victim and everyone else is the villain, there's no space for transformation. Blame is a clever disguise. It feels satisfying because when we blame, we release ourselves of responsibility. But what we don't notice is that in doing so, we also release ourselves from power. You cannot fix yourself because you were never broken. And yet almost every voice in your life has told you otherwise, whispering or shouting that there is something fundamentally wrong with you that must be corrected, improved, or hidden. You grow up wearing this invisible burden, carrying the belief that you are a problem waiting to be solved. A puzzle missing pieces, a house in need of repair. And this is the first illusion that must be dissolved if you are to live fully. For you see, the act of trying to fix yourself presupposes that you are inadequate, defective, or incomplete. The truth is that your being is not a machine with broken parts. It is a river flowing, changing, shaping and reshaping itself as it moves along. And the very notion of a fixed, permanent self that can be damaged or restored is a misunderstanding, a projection of the mechanical way we view the world onto the living, breathing mystery of consciousness, because what you are is not a product to be repaired, but a process to be experienced, and the process is always whole in its becoming. So when you take the position that you must fix yourself, you are unknowingly declaring war on your own nature, splitting yourself into two halves, the flawed one to be corrected and the imaginary perfect one who does the correcting. And this division is the root of endless suffering, because no matter how hard you work to improve the flawed self, it can never reach the perfection demanded by the imaginary one. The one who judges is also part of the illusion, and so the cycle continues endlessly, chasing an ideal that does not exist, running toward a horizon that forever recedes as you approach it. And this is why so many spend their lives trapped in self-help, spiritual practices, and endless comparisons, never realizing that the very effort to fix what was never broken is the problem itself. To see this clearly is to experience a freedom so radical it can feel frightening at first, because if you are not broken, then who are you without the story of fixing? Who are you without the role of seeker, without the endless struggle toward a better version of yourself? Here is where most stumble, because the mind insists on having a project, something to chase, something to solve. When the project of fixing disappears, the mind panics. It says, "But what will become of me if I stop trying to improve, if I stop striving? Won't I fall apart? Won't I fail? Won't I collapse into nothing?" And the answer is yes, you will collapse into nothing, but that nothing is not emptiness in the way the mind fears. It is openness. It is the vast spaciousness of being in which everything arises and passes. And when you rest there, when you let go of the exhausting work of improvement, you discover that the so-called flaws, the imperfections, the messiness of your life are not evidence of brokenness, but expressions of life itself. The cracks in the vase are not mistakes. They are the places where the light enters. And when you stop struggling against yourself, when you stop demanding that you be other than you are, you begin to notice the profound intelligence at work in every moment, the way wounds become teachers, the way failures carve out humility, the way even confusion points toward clarity if you stop running from it. The invitation is not to fix yourself but to see yourself, to sit quietly with what is, without judgment, without resistance. The more you try to repair yourself, the more you reinforce the false idea that something is wrong. But the more you relax into your own presence, the more you see that life does not need fixing, it needs experiencing, and what you call brokenness is simply the texture of being human. There is an immense beauty in that texture, because the ocean is not less ocean for having waves. The sky is not less sky for having clouds. You are not less whole for having doubts, fears, and contradictions. So stop polishing yourself like a stone that must be smooth and flawless. Instead, recognize that the rough edges, the cracks, the patterns etched by time are what make you alive. And once you see this, the energy that was wasted in self-rejection becomes available for something else. For joy, for curiosity, for love, simply being present. And this shift is not about abandoning growth. It is about understanding what real growth means. For growth is not about sanding down the self into some polished statue. Growth is about unfolding, like a flower, not by force but by alignment with your nature. And flowers do not wake up in the morning and declare themselves broken. Your tension. They do not seek therapy for their crooked stems or compare their petals to those of their neighbors. They simply grow as they are, reaching toward the light. And in that reaching, they fulfill their nature. So too with you, your task is not to fix yourself, but to allow yourself to unfold, to grow into the light that is already calling you. And this requires trust. Trust in the intelligence of life. Trust in the unfolding of your own being. Trust that you are not a mistake. And the irony is that once you stop trying to fix yourself, the changes you always longed for begin to happen naturally. Without force, without struggle, because they are no longer coming from rejection, but from love, from wholeness, from the recognition that even as you change, you were never lacking, you were never broken, and you never needed fixing. Most of us live inside a story of what should be. Without realizing it, we spend our lives bowing down to this invisible tyrant called should, chasing after it, arguing with it, and collapsing under its weight. And yet we rarely pause to question where it comes from, why it has such power over us, or whether it is even real. For this should is a phantom built from voices of the past. Parents, teachers, culture, religion, society, all echoing in the chambers of your mind, saying you should be smarter, you should be calmer, you should be richer, you should be thinner, you should have already figured it all out, you should not feel what you feel, you should not make mistakes, you should be different from who you are. And the tragedy is that by chasing this phantom, you abandon the only thing that ever truly exists, this moment, as it is, right now, without decoration, without comparison, without condition. And when you are constantly comparing life to some imaginary version of how it should be, you are blind to the miracle of how it is. The invitation is to recognize that reality, in its raw form, does not contain shoulds. Reality is simply what is unfolding, dancing, shifting, flowing in and out of form, and the only suffering arises when you hold reality up against the mirror of what you think it ought to be and declare it lacking. Yet what happens if you stop measuring, if you stop arguing, if you stop demanding that the present moment justify itself against some impossible standard? What happens if you meet reality not as an opponent, but as a teacher, whispering lessons in the language of wind, rain, heartbreak, and laughter? In truth, life is not concerned with your story of what should happen, it is simply being itself. And the sooner you can say yes to what is, the sooner you discover a freedom that cannot be shaken, a freedom born not from controlling life, but from opening to it. And this is not to say you must resign yourself to passivity. It is not about giving up or accepting injustice or tolerating harm, your full attention. Rather, it is about understanding the difference between resisting the present moment and responding to it. Resistance wastes energy in fighting the unchangeable, while response channels energy into transformation. So when something painful arises, the mind screams, "It shouldn't be this way." But that very scream multiplies the pain. It adds another layer of suffering on top of the raw experience. If you can see it as it is, without the veil of should, you are suddenly free to act wisely, to heal, to move, to change. And this is the essence of growth, not clinging to a fantasy, but engaging fully with reality. Yet we live in a culture that constantly sells us fantasies. Advertising that says you should look like this model, spiritual teachings twisted into saying you should always be peaceful, economic systems telling you that you should always want more, never content, never still, and so you are trained from birth to compare your life to an image, and images by their very nature are lifeless, flat, unattainable, while life, real life, is messy, alive, unpredictable, filled with dirt under your nails and laughter in the dark, with contradictions and paradoxes that no should can contain. So to step out of the tyranny of should is not merely a personal choice, it is an act of rebellion, a spiritual revolution, because it means you are daring to see that your life, exactly as it is, has value, has beauty, has meaning beyond what anyone told you it should be. And this shift changes everything: the way you see yourself, the way you see others, the way you engage with each breath, because when you are no longer chasing the ghost of should, you can actually see the person in front of you, hear the music in the silence, taste the sweetness in the ordinary, and what a relief it is to drop the endless project of perfecting reality. What a liberation to say, this moment is enough. Because from there, ironically, real transformation begins. Since true change does not come from rejecting what is, it comes from embracing it so fully that its natural evolution unfolds. Just as a seed does not become a tree by rejecting its state as a seed, but by fully inhabiting it, receiving the soil, the sun, the rain, allowing the process to happen, so too with you. Growth will happen not by shouting at life for being the wrong shape, but by leaning into the exact shape it takes. And when you lean into reality, you begin to notice its subtle guidance, the way discomfort points to what matters, the way disappointment clears space for new beginnings, the way loss deepens your capacity for love, and you begin to see that every twist and turn, even the ones you labeled as mistakes, part of a larger unfolding, the deeper wisdom. And so, not to demand that life conform to your plans, but to align yourself with the intelligence already at play, to become a participant in the dance rather than a critic at the edge of the floor. And this requires humility to admit that your should is small compared to the vastness of what is, the humility to see that your mind cannot grasp the full pattern of existence, and yet you are part of that pattern, inseparable from it, like a wave from the ocean. And when you stop demanding that the wave be straighter or taller or calmer, you see the ocean's beauty in each rise and fall. So the next time your mind whispers, "It should not be this way," pause, breathe, notice the ground beneath your feet. Notice the aliveness of this moment. Notice that even the thought of should is part of what is, and in seeing that, you create space. Space to respond instead of resist, space to love instead of fight, space to be instead of chase. And that space is freedom, that space is where joy lives. And so I say again, most of us live inside a story of what should be, but you do not have to. You can wake up from it, You can step out of the prison of comparison and into the open field of presence. And when you do, you will see that life, exactly as it is, has been waiting for you all along. Your mind is not the enemy, but it is not the master either. Yet most people live as though the mind is both jailer and judge, handing down endless sentences of worry, guilt, shame, and comparison, without ever pausing to ask, who gave this voice the authority to rule over me? Because the truth is, the mind is a tool, no different in essence from fire or water. And like fire, it can warm your house or burn it down. Like water, it can quench your thirst or drown you. So the question is never whether the mind is good or bad, but whether you know how to relate to it, whether you can recognize its nature and use it wisely. Lies the difficulty. Most people are so deeply identified with their thoughts that they cannot step back long enough to see that thinking is an activity, not an identity, a process, not a self. And when you are lost in thought, you are like a dreamer who does not know he is dreaming, trapped in stories, images, and fears that feel solid and real but are, in truth, only passing clouds across the sky of awareness. And the tragedy is that when you forget this, the stories of the mind become chains, and you mistake the voice in your head for reality itself, so that when the mind whispers, "You are not enough," you bow your head in shame. When it insists, "They are against you," you tighten your chest in fear. When it repeats, "You must be better, richer, stronger," you whip yourself into endless striving, all the while never noticing that these thoughts are not facts. They are simply patterns of energy, conditioned by your past, conditioned by your culture, conditioned by habits you never consciously chose. The first step toward freedom is simply to see the mind for what it is, a storyteller. Tireless, insistent, often dramatic, but not infallible. And once you see this, a space opens, a gap between the story and the awareness of the story, and in that gap is liberation. Suddenly, you realize you are not the narrator. You are the one hearing the narration. You are not the storm. You are the sky in which the storm arises, and this recognition changes everything. Because the mind does not have to be silenced for you to find peace. It simply has to be seen, and the moment you see it, the grip loosens, the spell breaks, and you are free to choose whether to follow the thought or to let it drift away like smoke. And the strange thing is that when you stop fighting the mind, when you stop making it the enemy, it softens, it becomes lighter, almost playful, and you begin to see that its stories, while not always true, are not always harmful either. They can be creative, imaginative, helpful when used as tools, but only when you know they are tools, because problems arise when the tool becomes the master, when the hammer decides where the nail should go, when the servant climbs onto the throne. And that is what has happened for most of humanity. The servant is ruling the house, and the house is in chaos, and your path forward is not to destroy the servant, but to remind him of his place, to gently but firmly take back the seat of awareness. And this seat is yours by birthright. It has never been lost, only overlooked, hidden beneath the constant chatter of thought. And to rediscover it is to discover a quiet power, the power to see without judgment, to allow without resistance, to live without being enslaved by every passing idea. And once you taste this freedom, you begin to see the mind differently. You begin to smile at its antics, the way you smile at a child playing dress up, declaring herself a queen, a dragon, a hero, and you know it is not true, but you enjoy the play without taking it too seriously. And this is how you can live with the mind as a play, a performance, a stream of commentary that you can use when helpful and release when harmful, and the less seriously you take it, the more lightly it moves. No longer heavy chains but ripples in the water, no longer a master but a servant. And this shift is not about control, not about beating the mind into silence, because control is just another thought, another story of, I should be this way. But rather about intimacy, about becoming familiar with how the mind moves, how it repeats patterns, how it clings to fears, how it seeks certainty. And once you are intimate with its movements, you stop being deceived by them. You stop mistaking every passing shadow for a monster. Instead, you see the shadows for what they are, shifting shapes cast by light, insubstantial, temporary, incapable of binding you. This awareness changes your entire relationship to suffering. Because suffering thrives in identification, in believing that every thought is truth. But when you see thoughts as thoughts, suffering begins to dissolve. It may still arise, like waves in the ocean, but it no longer defines you. It no longer swallows you whole, and you discover a calm that is deeper than thought, a calm that is always here, beneath the noise, waiting for you to notice it. And when you live from that calm, the mind is no longer an obstacle but an ally, a tool to create, to explore, to question, to imagine. And even when it slips back into fear, into judgment, into blame, you no longer panic, because you know you are not trapped. You know you can step back. You know the sky does not vanish because of the storm. And this knowing is the beginning of wisdom, not the wisdom of accumulating more knowledge, but the wisdom of seeing clearly, the wisdom of knowing what the mind is and what it is not. In that clarity there is compassion, because you realize that every human being is wrestling with their own mind, lost in stories they mistake for truth. And this recognition softens your heart, because you see that the struggles of others are not signs of weakness, but the natural result of forgetting, taking the storyteller too seriously. And in that compassion, you begin to walk more gently with yourself and with others, recognizing that we are all dreamers slowly waking up, learning to laugh at the drama of thought, learning to live from the spaciousness beyond it. The invitation is simple. Do not make the mind your enemy. Do not make it your master. See it, smile at it, use it when useful, release it when it is not, and remember that you are the awareness in which all thought arises and dissolves, untouched, unbroken, vast and free, like the sky itself. There is a subtle but powerful truth that most people avoid facing, that suffering is not something to be eliminated entirely, something to be understood, and indeed something that often becomes the very teacher we need to awaken, because we live in a culture that treats suffering as a flaw, a malfunction, something unnatural to be erased at all costs. We develop habits of avoidance, distraction, denial, numbing ourselves with noise, consumption, achievement, or perfection. Deeper question is not, how do I stop suffering? But, what is suffering trying to teach me? For when you stop resisting pain, when you stop treating it as an enemy, something remarkable happens. You begin to see that suffering is not the opposite of joy, but its companion, part of the same continuum, just as night and day are two expressions of the same sun. And when we separate ourselves from this reality, we trap ourselves in cycles of fear and avoidance, thinking that if only we could remove discomfort, life would be perfect. But the truth is, discomfort is the signal that life is moving, that something is being stirred within us. The invitation is not to escape, but to lean in, to listen deeply to the message hidden within the ache, whether it comes from loss, failure, longing, grief, or uncertainty, because these experiences are not accidents, they are part of the fabric of living, woven into the texture of being human, and to deny them is to deny life itself, and yet leaning into suffering requires courage, the courage to face what we have spent our lives running from, the courage to sit with uncertainty without a map, without a guarantee of resolution, the courage to allow ourselves to be broken open so that we might be remade, because suffering, when approached with openness, can become a doorway to transformation, to greater depth, to intimacy with ourselves and the world. And the first step in this process is honesty. Honesty about what is true in this moment without glossing over the pain, without distracting ourselves with stories of what should be, because when we tell ourselves stories to cover pain, we make it bigger, we turn it into an unresolved wound, a shadow that grows stronger in the dark. Whereas when we name it, feel it, and acknowledge it, we begin to dissolve the grip it has on us. And this is not easy, for our mind is trained to resist suffering, to mask it with judgment, resistance, and escape. Yet real healing begins in that moment of willingness to be present with discomfort, and this presence changes everything, because it shifts your relationship to your own experience. You stop seeing pain as a threat, and begin to see it as a teacher, your full attention a mirror reflecting something you have not yet integrated, a signpost pointing toward what is alive in you and what is calling for attention, and so the act of sitting with suffering becomes an act of courage and of self-discovery, revealing layers of yourself you might never have known. This is where growth lives, in the willingness to meet yourself in the middle of your wounds rather than on the other side of them. And in this meeting there is an alchemy, a transformation that comes not from avoiding suffering, but from living it fully, from allowing it to be exactly as it is, without embellishment, without resistance, without trying to force it away, because resistance only adds suffering to suffering, while acceptance dissolves it at its root. And here lies a paradox. Acceptance does not mean passivity. It does not mean giving up. It means opening to what is so deeply that you can then act from a place of clarity and strength, rather than reaction and fear. And in that clarity, the right actions often reveal themselves, not through frantic striving, but through deep listening to the needs of the moment. And this listening requires stillness, presence, the willingness to be with whatever is happening without trying to control it, surrender to the process of life, even when the process feels painful or uncertain. Because in surrender there is a kind of strength that is not weak, but profoundly powerful, the power to meet life as it comes, without flinching, out the endless need to fix, change, or escape. And this is where the heart of wisdom lies, in the recognition that life is not something to be solved. Life is something to be lived, and suffering is part of the living, a signal that something is shifting, that growth is unfolding. And the moment you stop treating suffering as a defect and start treating it as a teacher, your life begins to change, because you stop running from your own experience and start moving toward it. And in that movement there is healing, there is understanding, there is transformation, and the more you practice this, the more natural it becomes to live in this way, to approach every moment, painful or joyful, with openness and curiosity. And you begin to see that life is not about avoiding difficulty, but about learning to dance with it, to move gracefully through the storms, to find beauty in the cracks, to discover joy even in the midst of suffering, because joy and suffering are not separate, they are two sides of the same coin, and only by embracing both fully can you know the richness of life. The question is not how to get rid of suffering, but how to be with it, how to transform it into insight, compassion, and connection, because every moment of suffering holds within it the seed of awakening. And when you lean into it with openness, when you allow yourself to feel fully, without retreat, without judgment, you awaken to a deeper dimension of yourself. And this is the wisdom of living fully, not to escape pain, but to live in such intimacy with it, that it becomes a teacher, a path, and ultimately a doorway to freedom. And when you stand at that doorway, looking back at the years of avoiding discomfort, you begin to see that the resistance was the real suffering. The letting go of resistance is the real healing. And in that letting go there is peace, there is clarity, there is freedom, and there is the deep, unshakable knowing that life, in all its beauty and pain, is enough, and has always been enough. There is a hidden truth that few people truly contemplate. That freedom is not something you earn. It is not something to be achieved in the future when conditions are right, but a state of being that exists in this very moment, if only you are willing to step out of the endless trap of seeking and striving, because most of us live under the illusion that freedom lies somewhere ahead, in some future state where problems are solved, circumstances are perfect, people understand us, and pain has disappeared. But the reality is that such conditions never fully exist, and if you are always waiting for them, you will be waiting forever, which is why freedom is not a destination but an art of learning how to live fully in the present regardless of the external conditions. And the first step in this art is to recognize the subtle chains we have built around ourselves through thought, habit, identity, and belief. Freedom is rarely about breaking physical chains, but about dissolving invisible ones, those narratives in the mind that define who we are, what we can and cannot do, what life should be, and what we deserve. And these narratives are so subtle, so woven into the fabric of who we think we are, that we seldom notice them, and yet they are the prisons of our own making, cages built not of steel but of ideas, fears, and illusions. The liberation of these cages comes not through force or struggle, but through insight, awareness, and a deep willingness to question everything we have been taught to believe. Because freedom is not granted. It is remembered, it is uncovered, it is reclaimed when we stop living under the orders of thought and begin to live in alignment with presence. And presence is the key that unlocks the door, because it is in presence that we discover there was never a need to fix ourselves in the first place. The idea of fixing comes from a place of separation from the belief that we are lacking, incomplete, flawed, and that belief itself is one of the deepest obstacles to freedom. And so the path toward freedom begins with the courage to look at this belief directly, to see the subtle ways in which it shapes our choices, and to ask, who am I if I am not striving to fix myself? And when you begin to sit with this question without rushing to answer it, without falling into habitual thought, something shifts, because the question itself begins to open a space of possibility, a space where you realize that you have been carrying the weight of an illusion, and once the illusion falls away, freedom is revealed as your natural state, not something distant or conditional but present here and now, like air or sunlight, waiting quietly for you to notice. Yet noticing it requires stillness, because the mind is trained to fill every moment with movement, distraction, noise. The habit of running keeps us from the truth, which is that freedom is not something to be pursued in the future, but something to be allowed in the present. And stillness gives you the capacity to recognize it, because stillness dissolves the illusion that you need to be anywhere else or anyone else to be free. And in that stillness you begin to see that you have been free all along, only you have been too busy chasing illusions to realize it. And this is why presence is not an escape from life's responsibilities, but the most profound form of responsibility there is. The responsibility to be awake, to live consciously, to see clearly what is here before you, without the filter of fear, judgment, or desire for something else. Living in presence means embracing life as it is, without clinging to the past, without grasping for the future, without needing to control, fix, perfect. And in that embrace there is a deep release, a letting go of the constant pressure to become, to prove, to perform. In that letting go there is a kind of freedom that is not a goal but a way of living, a state of being that is available to you in every moment, no matter what circumstances surround you. And this is where the true power of freedom lies. Not in changing the world to suit your needs, but in changing your relationship to the world so that you live without the constant inner compulsion to control or resist. When you live in this way you discover a deep joy that is not dependent on outer conditions, a joy that comes from the recognition that life, as it is already complete, already enough. And this joy is not a fleeting pleasure, but a steady state of ease, a sense of being at home in the world, a trust in the unfolding of life itself. And the deeper you go into this state, more you realize that freedom is not a separate achievement, but the very essence of existence. And the more you remember this truth, the less you will be bound by the illusion of limitation, your full attention. The less you will be imprisoned by the stories you tell yourself about who you are and what life should be. And the more you will live from a place of openness, clarity, and love. Because freedom is not something to be fought for in the sense of battle, but something to be awakened to, like waking from a dream. And the awakening comes not through force, but through gentle recognition, through the willingness to look deeply at yourself without the need to fix, change, or escape. And in that looking there is liberation, because you see that there is nothing to fix, nothing to escape from, nothing missing, nothing wrong, and that the chains were never real, only imagined. The moment you see this you are free, utterly and completely, not because the world has changed but because your mind has. This shift is the gift of presence, the heart of freedom, and the essence of living fully. And once you taste it, once you rest in that freedom, life will never feel the same again, because you will no longer live from a place of striving or fear, but from a place of deep ease, trust, and openness to what is. And this is the art of living, to live as if you are already free, to remember that you have always been free. Let that truth shape every breath, every thought, every choice you make. There is a deep and often overlooked truth about the nature of change, which is that change does not come from force or effort in the way we often imagine, because our culture trains us to believe that transformation is a matter of willpower, of pushing harder, doing more, fixing ourselves, striving toward a better version of who we are. The reality is that real change comes from a deeper source. A source that is not about control, but about alignment, your attention, about listening deeply to what is already present and allowing it to guide the transformation. Because the more we struggle to force change, the more resistance we create, and resistance is the real barrier to growth, the invisible weight that keeps us stuck in cycles of repetition. The question is not, how do I change myself? But, how do I stop resisting myself? And in that shift of question, there lies a profound opening. Because resistance is always rooted in the belief that who we are right now is not enough. that there is something fundamentally wrong with us that must be fixed, improved, or altered, and that belief creates an endless loop of striving, a loop that keeps us disconnected from the very source of change, which is presence, awareness, and acceptance. This is why many efforts at change fail. They come from a place of self-rejection rather than self-acceptance, and when change begins from rejection, it carries with it an energy of tension, of pushing against life rather than flowing with it. The art of change begins with self-acceptance, not as an excuse to remain stagnant, but as the fertile ground from which real transformation grows. Because when you accept yourself fully in this moment, stop fighting against the present and open yourself to the possibility of something new emerging naturally, without force, without strain, without the exhausting battle to become someone else. And this acceptance is not passive resignation, but an active engagement with the reality of who you are now, seeing clearly your strengths and weaknesses, your patterns and habits, without judgment, your full attention, without story, without the compulsive need to change them immediately. And in that seeing there is a kind of clarity that shifts the whole dynamic, because clarity dissolves resistance, and resistance is the true obstacle to transformation. And once resistance falls away, change begins to happen effortlessly, as a natural unfolding rather than a forced process. And this is why the path of transformation is not a straight line, but a subtle dance between presence and movement, between acceptance and intention. And this dance requires patience, because real change takes time, not the time measured by calendars or deadlines, but the time of deep inner alignment, the time that comes when you stop chasing change and start allowing it, when you stop trying to manufacture a new self and instead open to the process of becoming. And this process is not linear, because life itself is not linear. The growth that matters most often comes quietly, gradually, in ways that are not obvious until you look back and see how far you have come. This is where trust becomes essential. Trust in life, trust in the process, trust in yourself. Because without trust, change becomes an act of desperation rather than a natural unfolding. And desperation creates tension and collapse rather than growth and freedom. And trust is cultivated through presence, through being fully awake to each moment without trying to rush, control, or escape it. And when you practice this kind of awareness, you begin to notice how change is already happening in subtle ways, in small shifts of perception, in moments of letting go, in the quiet rearrangement of your inner world. And these small shifts accumulate until change becomes inevitable. And the irony is that the harder you try to force change, the more you block it. But the softer, more present, and more accepting you become, the more change flows naturally, like water finding its way. And this is the paradox of transformation. It is not achieved through relentless effort, but through a deep openness to what already is, through a willingness to be fully present, through the letting go of control. And in that letting go there is a kind of freedom that allows change to happen without strain, without fear, without resistance. And this is why the true art of change is an art of presence, because presence dissolves resistance. Presence dissolves the need to fix yourself, and presence opens you to the unfolding of life in its own time, its own way. And this unfolding is the change itself, a change that is not separate from who you are, but an expression of your deepest nature. The deeper you go into presence, the more you discover that transformation is not something you do, but something you allow, something you awaken to. And when you live in this way, change becomes not a source of anxiety or struggle, but a natural expression of life. a flow that carries you forward without the burden of constant striving, and in that flow there is peace, there is clarity, there is joy, and there is the quiet, unshakable knowing that transformation is not about becoming someone else but about awakening to the truth of who you already are. That truth is always present, always available, and always free. There is a profound misunderstanding about the nature of responsibility that most of us carry, which is the belief that responsibility means control, that to be responsible is to manage every detail of life so that nothing goes wrong. But the truth is that true responsibility is not control, because control is an illusion, and the more we attempt to control life, the more we struggle against its natural flow, and this struggle creates stress, anxiety, and a deep sense of frustration. Life itself is unpredictable, constantly shifting, and beyond our ability to fully direct, and responsibility is not about micromanaging reality, but about cultivating an awareness and alignment that allows us to meet life as it comes, without resistance and without blame. And this is why the first step toward true responsibility is to stop blaming others, stop pointing fingers, stop making life dependent on someone else's actions. Because when you always attribute fault externally, you give away your power, and you remain stuck in a state of victimhood, which is a kind of surrender to circumstances, rather than a conscious engagement with life. Victimhood is comfortable in a strange way, because it removes the burden of self-examination and allows us to project our inner unrest outward. But that projection is a trap, because it keeps us from facing the deeper truth that we are always participants in the creation of our own reality, whether consciously or unconsciously. And this is not to say that external conditions do not matter, or that injustice, harm, and wrongdoing are illusions, but rather that the deeper shift in responsibility comes when we stop making our happiness, peace, or sense of self contingent upon external conditions, instead begin to look inward, to examine our own thoughts, assumptions, and responses, because it is here, in this inner space, that we find our true power. And the moment we stop blaming others, we step into the real work of living consciously, which is to take full ownership of how we respond to life, of how we interpret events, of the meaning we give to what happens to us. And this ownership is liberating, because it returns to us the authority over our own experience. And when you embrace this, life shifts from being something that happens to you into something you engage with creatively and responsibly. And this shift changes everything. Suddenly, you stop being a passive recipient of life's circumstances and begin to live as a conscious co-creator of your reality. And that is the essence of personal growth, the essence of maturity, and the essence of living fully. Because maturity is not measured by control over life's circumstances, but by the ability to meet them with clarity, awareness, and compassion. And compassion begins with ourselves, because we cannot truly be responsible without first taking responsibility for our own inner state. For the stories we tell ourselves, for the emotional patterns that shape our perception, and once we do this work, we see clearly how interdependent life truly is, how every action, thought, and intention ripples outward, affecting not just ourselves but those around us. This recognition of interconnectedness deepens responsibility, because it reminds us that our choices matter not only for ourselves but for the whole, that we are not isolated beings acting in a vacuum, but living expressions of a vast web of life. And when we live with this awareness, responsibility becomes an act of love, not obligation, because it comes from the recognition that our own well-being is intimately tied to the well-being of others, and that to harm another is to harm ourselves. To nurture another is to nurture the whole, and this understanding dissolves the old binary of blame and victimhood, replacing it with a sense of shared participation and mutual care, and in this shared space, responsibility becomes a joyful expression of life rather than a burden, because it emerges from presence rather than from fear, and presence transforms responsibility into something organic, something flowing, something natural, like breathing, because when you live responsively, you are attuned to the moment, to the needs that arise, to the possibilities that unfold, no longer react out of habit or fear, but respond with clarity, with wisdom, with love. This kind of responsibility does not seek to dominate life, but to dance with it, to move in harmony with the unfolding of reality. That dance is not rigid or predetermined, but spontaneous and alive, because life itself is alive, and to be truly responsible is to honor that life, to honor the mystery of existence, and to meet each moment with openness, acceptance, and gratitude. And gratitude is the final and most beautiful expression of responsibility, because gratitude is the recognition that life itself is a gift, that everything we have and are is not owed to us by some external power, but is the result of an unbroken flow of existence. To live responsibly is to honor that flow, to respond to it with care and presence, and in doing so we awaken to the deeper truth that life is not about fixing what is broken, but about awakening to what is already whole. And when we live from this place of awakening, we step out of the endless cycle of blame and fault, and step into a life of clarity, freedom, and grace. This is the essence of true responsibility, the path of growth, and the heart of living fully. There is a subtle but profound shift that happens when we begin to understand that personal growth is not about achieving some final state of perfection or fixing ourselves once and for all, because the very idea of perfection assumes a static endpoint in a constantly changing world. Life itself is not static. It is an endless process of becoming, of evolving, movement. And so the deeper truth is that growth is not a destination, but a way of living, a continual openness to change, a willingness to explore, to stretch, to discover who we are in each new moment. And this understanding changes everything about how we approach ourselves, our struggles, and our relationships, because when growth is no longer about fixing a perceived flaw, but about engaging deeply with the present moment, it becomes less of a burden and more of a dance, less of a project to be completed and more of a living art. And this art begins with curiosity, because curiosity opens the door to transformation in a way that striving cannot. Curiosity allows us to step outside of our habitual patterns and question the assumptions we hold, to see not only the things we want to change, but also the things we have overlooked. When we cultivate curiosity, we move from a mindset of self-judgment to one of self-inquiry, from a place of resistance to a place of openness. Openness is the fertile ground from which true growth emerges, because openness allows us to encounter life as it is, without the heavy burden of expectation or the compulsive need to control the outcome. And when we meet life in this way, we discover that what we thought were limitations are often invitations, that challenges are not roadblocks but openings into deeper understanding, and this reframing changes the way we move through life. Because instead of resisting difficulty, we begin to see it as part of the unfolding of our growth. This is the essence of transformation. Not to escape difficulty, but to engage with it consciously, to learn from it, and to allow it to shape us in ways that we cannot imagine from the vantage point of fear or resistance. and this engagement requires courage, because to truly grow we must be willing to face ourselves honestly, to face the parts of ourselves that we would rather avoid, the fears, insecurities, and patterns that have defined us for years, and this facing is not a single act but an ongoing practice, a daily commitment to presence, to self-awareness, self-compassion, because without compassion growth can easily become harsh self-criticism, and harsh self-criticism only deepens resistance, reinforces old patterns, and blocks the flow of change, whereas compassion creates a safe inner environment where growth can unfold naturally, without force, without judgment, and this compassion begins with acceptance. The acceptance that you are a work in progress, that you are imperfect, and that this imperfection is not a flaw to be eradicated, but the soil from which growth springs, and when we accept this truth we open ourselves to the deeper possibility of transformation, your tension which is not the fixing of ourselves, but the awakening to who we already are. And this awakening transforms the nature of growth itself, because it releases growth from the grip of obligation and turns it into an act of love, a creative unfolding that comes from the fullness of presence, rather than the scarcity of self-judgment. And in this unfolding, there is a kind of freedom that cannot be attained through effort alone, because freedom is not something we manufacture, but something we uncover when we stop holding ourselves hostage to the idea that we must constantly improve in order to be worthy. And worthiness is not earned by achieving some ideal state, but is inherent in the fact of our existence. And when we live from this truth, our growth becomes a joyful exploration rather than a painful struggle, a journey of discovery rather than a relentless pursuit of perfection. And this journey requires patience, because growth does not happen according to our timelines, but according to the natural rhythm of life, and life unfolds in its own time, in its own way, and this unfolding cannot be rushed without losing something essential. And what is lost in rushing is the depth of the journey itself, the richness of learning that comes from being fully present with each stage of growth. And so the path of growth is not a straight line, but a spiral, a returning to deeper layers of ourselves again and again, each time with more awareness, more acceptance, more openness. And this spiral is the true shape of transformation, because it reflects the living nature of change. In this living process, we discover that growth is not something we achieve, but something we become, a way of being that flows naturally from presence, curiosity, compassion, and acceptance. And when we live in this way, we awaken to the deeper truth that we are not separate from life, but expressions of it, and growth becomes not the fixing of something broken, but the unfolding of something whole. And in this unfolding there is a deep and lasting joy, because we come to understand that the journey itself is the destination, and the art of living fully is to meet that journey with open hearts, curious minds, and the willingness to grow not by striving to become something else, but by awakening to the fullness of who we already are in this ever-changing, beautiful, mysterious moment of life. There is a deep and often unrecognized truth about the nature of fear, which is that fear is not something to be eliminated or eradicated, because fear is not the enemy of growth but a signal, a guidepost, a messenger pointing us toward places within ourselves that require attention, awareness, and transformation. And this is why the approach to fear must be radically different from the way culture trains us to treat it. Because we are taught to avoid fear, to suppress it, to overcome it through brute force or distraction, and this avoidance creates a deeper resistance that strengthens fear rather than dissolving it, The first step toward transforming fear is not to fight it, but to acknowledge it, to sit with it, to meet it without judgment, because when we meet fear with presence, it loses its power to control us. And in that presence there is a strange paradox. The more fully we face our fears, the less they dominate us, and the more we discover that fear is not a fixed enemy, but a living process, a dynamic part of life that has its own purpose, and that purpose is to show us where we are resisting reality, where we are unwilling to accept what is, and it is in that resistance that suffering arises. Because fear grows in the soil of avoidance, of the desire to control and predict the future. So the transformation of fear is not about erasing it, but about transforming our relationship to it, which begins with awareness, awareness that allows us to see fear for what it really is. Not a permanent state, but a passing experience, a sensation that arises in response to perceived threat, and that perception is not reality, but interpretation, and interpretation can be questioned, examined, and shifted, and this shift comes not from willpower alone, but from a deep presence that opens the space for seeing clearly, without the distortion of story or judgment, and this presence is cultivated through practice. Through meditation, reflection, self-inquiry, and the willingness to be with what is uncomfortable without fleeing. And when we cultivate this presence, we begin to see fear as a teacher rather than a tyrant, a guide rather than a barrier, because fear points us toward what matters, toward places where our growth is possible, if we are willing to step into the uncertainty, into the unknown. And this stepping into the unknown is the essence of courage, not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act in spite of it. Courage is not a fixed quality, but a practice, a choice we make moment by moment, a willingness to be present with life, even when it feels dangerous or uncertain. And in this practice of courage there is transformation, because fear dissolves when it is met with awareness and action. The action does not have to be large or dramatic. It can be as simple as choosing to breathe, to notice, to step forward even slightly, because the accumulation of small acts of presence and courage transforms the whole fabric of our inner life. This transformation is the deeper purpose of fear, to draw us into the fullness of our own being, to strip away illusion, to awaken us to the truth that life is lived most fully when we are willing to engage with it, without guarantee, without control, without certainty. Engagement requires trust. Trust in ourselves, trust in life, trust in the unfolding of reality, because fear is often rooted in the belief that life is unsafe. And that belief is dissolved by trust, and trust is cultivated not by avoiding danger, but by meeting danger with awareness, by stepping into life fully aware that we cannot control the outcome, yet willing to live anyway. And this willingness is the heart of freedom, because freedom does not come from controlling every possibility, but from accepting the uncertainty and choosing to live with open hands and an open heart. And in that openness fear transforms into a kind of aliveness, because life without fear is not life but numbness, and fear, when met with presence, becomes the very energy that fuels growth, depth, and vitality. And this is why the path of living fully is inseparable from the path of transforming fear, because life itself is uncertain, unpredictable, and ever changing. And to live fully is to step into that uncertainty with awareness, courage, and trust. And when we do this, we discover that fear is not a weakness to be overcome, but a doorway to deeper understanding, a threshold that invites us to grow, to awaken, and to live more deeply than we ever thought possible. And this living deeply is the essence of freedom, the essence of presence, and the essence of truly being alive. And so the art of transforming fear is not to escape it, but to welcome it, to meet it with awareness, allow it to teach us, to guide us, and to transform us. And in that transformation there is liberation, there is clarity, and there is the profound peace that comes when we no longer see fear as an enemy, but as a partner on the path of growth. In that partnership we find that the true power of living fully comes not from the absence of fear, but from the courage to walk with it, to learn from it, to let it guide us toward the fullness of life itself. There is a profound and often overlooked dimension to the process of transformation, which is the recognition that change does not come primarily through external effort, but through a deep shift in the way we relate to ourselves and to life, because we live most of our lives caught in habitual patterns of thought, judgment, and reaction that we mistake for reality, and these patterns shape the way we see ourselves and the world so completely that we rarely question them. True transformation begins not with changing circumstances, but with changing perception, and this change in perception comes through an inner discipline of awareness, of becoming attentive to the thoughts, beliefs, inner dialogues that govern our experience. And as we become aware of these patterns, we begin to see that many of them are rooted in unconscious fear, attachment, and a desire for control, and this realization opens the possibility of a deeper freedom, because when we see the source of our suffering, we no longer need to live unconsciously under its influence. This is why the work of transformation is not primarily about doing, but about seeing, not about fixing ourselves, but about opening ourselves to a new way of perceiving, a perception grounded in presence, acceptance, and compassion. Because without presence we cannot truly change, and without acceptance transformation becomes a form of resistance rather than growth. Without compassion it becomes harsh self-criticism that reinforces the very patterns we wish to escape. And this is why the art of transformation lies in cultivating an inner environment of awareness, acceptance, and compassion. Because in such an environment change happens naturally, organically, without force. And in this natural unfolding we discover that transformation is not a destination to be reached, but a living process to be embraced, a continual becoming rather than a finite achievement. And this continual becoming is itself a kind of liberation, because it frees us from the trap of identifying with a fixed self, with a fixed idea of who we are or who we should be. Instead invites us to live as open, dynamic beings who are willing to evolve moment by moment, and this willingness to evolve is the heart of living fully, because life itself is constant change, and to resist change is to resist life. And when we resist life we create suffering. But when we embrace change we open ourselves to the fullness of experience, to the depth of transformation that comes from living with presence and openness, and this openness comes through practice. A daily return to awareness, a daily willingness to look honestly at ourselves, to see without judgment the ways we hold ourselves back, the ways we cling to old stories, and the ways we avoid our own truth. And this daily practice becomes a kind of inner revolution, because it transforms the way we live from the inside out, changing not only our relationship to ourselves, but also our relationship to the world. As we transform our inner landscape, we see the world differently, and we respond differently to its challenges and invitations. And this is the deeper power of transformation, that it does not end with personal change, but ripples outward into every aspect of life, creating a shift in how we relate to others, to our work, to nature, and to the unfolding of existence itself. This ripple effect is why transformation is not a private matter, but a profoundly communal one. Each act of inner change contributes to a larger collective transformation. And this collective transformation begins with the recognition that we are not separate from the world, but intimately connected to it, and that our personal growth is inseparable from the growth of the whole. And this understanding dissolves the illusion of separation that fuels much of human conflict, because when we see that our well-being is bound up with the well-being of others, we begin to live with greater compassion, empathy, and responsibility. In this living we embody the truth that transformation is not about escaping reality, but about engaging with it fully, with presence, courage, and an open heart, and this engagement transforms not only our own lives, but the lives of those around us, because transformation, at its deepest level, a movement of awakening. An awakening to the interconnectedness of all life, to the reality that we are not isolated beings struggling to fix ourselves, but living expressions of a larger whole that is constantly unfolding. And this awakening dissolves the illusion of limitation and replaces it with a deep sense of possibility, because we begin to live not from fear but from trust, not from scarcity but from abundance, not from separation but from unity. In this living there is a profound joy. Transformation becomes not a task to be completed, but a way of being that flows naturally from the fullness of presence. And in that presence we discover that the journey itself is the transformation, and that the art of living fully is not found in arriving somewhere, but in embracing the ever-changing moment with openness, curiosity, and love. This embracing is the heart of what it means to transform, to awaken, and to live with true freedom, knowing that the process of transformation is not something we achieve once and for all, but a continuous unfolding, a lifetime of becoming, and this becoming is the gift of life itself. True transformation, the kind that penetrates to the core of our being, requires an understanding that growth is never a purely intellectual endeavor, but a deep experiential process that unfolds through the interplay of awareness, choice, and surrender, because human life is lived within layers of conditioning, inherited beliefs, cultural narratives, and personal stories that shape how we perceive reality, and unless we begin to see those layers clearly, we remain unconscious participants in patterns that repeat endlessly. So the work of transformation begins with awakening to this unconsciousness, with the willingness to step back from the flow of habitual thought and to observe, without judgment, the mental and emotional patterns that run beneath the surface. This kind of witnessing is a radical act of freedom, because it creates a space between stimulus and response where choice becomes possible, and within that space lies the possibility of transformation, the possibility of seeing life without the distortion of fear, habit, or reactivity. This is why cultivating awareness is central to the path of transformation, because awareness is the lens through which we perceive reality, and when that lens shifts, so too does everything we experience. Shift in awareness begins with the recognition that who we think we are is not fixed, but fluid, and that identity itself is a process, a story we tell ourselves that can change, and this recognition is both liberating and unsettling, because it means letting go of the solidity of self and stepping into the unknown, and yet it is in that unknown that transformation takes place, because growth requires the dissolution of old structures so that new ones can emerge, and this process of letting go is not something to be forced, but something to be cultivated through trust, patience, and presence, because transformation unfolds in its own timing, and resistance to that timing only deepens struggle. So the path of transformation is not about achieving control, but about cultivating a relationship with life in which we can meet each moment fully, without grasping or rejecting, and this meeting of life as it is becomes the foundation for lasting change, because transformation is not a matter of adding something new, but of uncovering what is already there, of seeing through the illusions of self and fear to the reality that has been present all along. This uncovering requires a kind of courage that is not about conquering life, but about opening to it with humility and trust. Because true courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to be with fear without being consumed by it. And in that willingness there is a deep shift, a transformation that moves us beyond self-protection into self-discovery. This self-discovery reveals that transformation is not a final destination, but a living path, a continual unfolding in which we become more fully ourselves by becoming more fully present. And presence itself is the essence of transformation. Your full attention, because when we are present there's no need to fix ourselves or our circumstances. There is only the openness to what is, and this openness creates a fertile ground for change, for insight, and for growth, and this growth does not follow a linear path, but flows like a river, sometimes moving swiftly, sometimes pausing, always changing course, and this fluidity is the nature of transformation, which cannot be controlled or forced. The role of the seeker is not to impose change, but to cultivate a state of receptivity, a willingness to learn from whatever life brings, and this receptivity is an expression of trust. Trust not in a fixed outcome, but in the process of life itself, and this trust transforms the way we live, because it allows us to release the need for certainty, and to embrace the mystery of existence. In embracing that mystery we discover a deeper freedom, a freedom that is not dependent on conditions, but rooted in the openness of our own awareness. And this freedom becomes the heart of transformation, because it frees us from the constraints of fear and self-limitation. And in that freedom we begin to live in a way that is aligned with the deepest truth of our being, which is that we are not separate from life, but an expression of it. And when we live from this truth, transformation becomes natural, effortless, and continuous, because it is no longer an effort to change but a living unfolding, a participation in the constant evolution of existence. And this participation is the gift of transformation, because it allows us to live fully, without fear, without clinging, without resistance. In that living we discover that transformation is not something we achieve once and for all, but a continual renewal, a journey without end. In that journey we awaken to the reality that the true work of transformation is not to fix ourselves, but to awaken to who we truly are, to live in alignment with that truth, and to allow our lives to become a reflection of that awakening. In this way transformation is both the path and the destination, both the practice and the realization, and it is in living that path with openness, presence, and trust that we discover the deepest meaning of transformation, which is the art of living fully, freely, awake. Transformation at its deepest level comes not from adding something new to ourselves, but from stripping away what is false, habitual, and imposed, because we carry within us layers of conditioning that obscure the truth of who we are, and these layers are formed from cultural expectations, childhood experiences, societal pressures, and personal fears, all of which create a false sense of identity. This false self becomes the main obstacle to living fully, because it operates unconsciously, dictating how we think, feel, and act. Until we begin to see these patterns we cannot truly change, And so transformation begins with awareness, with the courage to look honestly at the layers we have built around ourselves and to question them without judgment, because judgment keeps us locked in separation, whereas openness invites us to see ourselves with clarity and compassion. This clarity reveals that transformation is not about fixing a broken self, but about uncovering the self that has always been present beneath the layers of conditioning. This uncovering is a process of unlearning as much as learning, of letting go of old beliefs and habits that no longer serve us so that a deeper truth can emerge. And this process requires patience, because these layers have been built over a lifetime and cannot be removed all at once. And it also requires courage, because letting go involves facing uncertainty and stepping into the unknown, and yet it is precisely in this letting go that transformation occurs, because when we release what is not true, we create space for what is. And that space is fertile ground for new growth. This growth is not about becoming someone else, but about becoming more of who we truly are. And who we truly are is not a fixed identity, but a living presence, a dynamic flow of awareness, feeling, and being. This living presence is the essence of transformation, because it shifts our relationship to life itself, allowing us to respond to each moment with openness rather than reactivity, and to meet life as it is rather than as we fear or desire it to be. And this shift is the heart of transformation, because it moves us from a life lived in reaction to a life lived in conscious participation, and conscious participation requires an inner discipline of presence, attention, and self-inquiry, because without these qualities we fall back into habitual patterns without realizing it. This is why transformation is not a one-time event, but a continuous practice, a way of living that unfolds moment by moment. Each moment of awareness is a step in that process, because transformation is not about reaching a destination, but about living in a state of continual becoming, a becoming that is shaped by our willingness to remain open, curious, and attentive to the unfolding of life. And this willingness arises from a deeper understanding that transformation is not separate from living, but is living itself. And when we live in this way, we begin to see that every experience, every challenge, every moment of discomfort or joy is an opportunity for transformation, because each moment offers a choice to cling to old patterns or to allow ourselves to grow beyond them. And this choice is the essence of freedom, because freedom is not found in escaping life but in choosing to meet it fully, with presence, acceptance, and courage. And this meeting of life is what transforms us, because it dissolves the illusion of separation and reveals the truth that we are not isolated selves but part of a larger whole. And this realization changes everything, because it shifts the focus from fixing ourselves to awakening to our true nature, and awakening is the deepest form of transformation, because it is the recognition that we are not broken, that we are already whole, and that the work of transformation is simply the process of remembering and living that truth. And this remembering transforms the way we live, because it transforms how we see ourselves, how we relate to others, and how we engage with life. And in this living there is a deep sense of ease, freedom, and joy, because transformation is no longer an effort to become something we are not, but a return to what we have always been, a living in harmony with the flow of existence. And this harmony is the heart of the wisdom of transformation, because it teaches us that change is not something to be forced or controlled, but something to be embraced with trust, openness, and love. And in that embracing we discover that transformation is not a final achievement, but a way of being, a way of living fully and freely in each moment. It is in living in this way that transformation fulfills its deepest promise, which is the awakening to our own wholeness and the embodiment of that awakening in every aspect of life. And so the work of transformation becomes the art of living, and living becomes the expression of transformation. This is the profound truth at the heart of the journey, that to transform is to awaken, and to awaken is to live fully, freely, and deeply in the truth of who we are. The process of true transformation reveals itself as a continual unfolding, not something that can be hurried or imposed, because life itself is a living process that moves according to its own rhythms, and when we attempt to control it, we often resist the very flow that transformation requires. The first step in embracing transformation is to surrender. Not in the sense of giving up, but in the sense of allowing life to teach us through its unfolding. And this surrender opens the door to a deeper kind of growth, because it releases the tension that comes from struggling against what is, and allows us to meet each moment as it arises, with openness rather than resistance. And this openness is an act of trust, a trust that life is guiding us toward what we need to become, if we cannot see the path ahead, and this trust emerges when we cultivate a deep presence. Because presence dissolves the illusion of separation between ourselves and life. When that illusion falls away, we begin to see that transformation is not about acquiring something new, but about revealing what has always been, the truth of our own being. And this revelation changes the way we live, because it shifts our focus from trying to fix ourselves to allowing ourselves to be. In that allowing, we discover the freedom that transformation brings, and this freedom is not an abstract idea, but a lived experience, one that arises when we stop resisting ourselves, our feelings, and our circumstances. And this is the essence of transformation: cease fighting, and to begin listening deeply, to listen to life without the interference of judgment, expectation, or fear. And when we listen in this way, we begin to see that transformation is not a destination, but a way of living, a way of being that embraces change as a natural part of existence. And this embrace transforms our relationship to life, because it changes how we experience challenges, uncertainty, and loss, turning them from obstacles into teachers, from moments of fear into opportunities for awakening your full attention. And this turning requires an inner courage that goes beyond the courage of action and enters the courage of presence, the courage to be fully present with whatever is, without seeking to escape or alter it. And in that presence we discover that transformation is not about becoming someone else, but about becoming more fully who we already are. Who we already are is not fixed but alive, unfolding in every moment, and this living unfolding is the heart of transformation, your full attention, because it reveals that transformation is not something to be achieved but something to be lived, moment by moment, breath by breath. When we live in this way, we step into a kind of freedom that is not dependent on external circumstances, but grounded in the depth of our own awareness. This depth is cultivated through the discipline of self-reflection, because transformation requires that we look deeply at our own minds, our motivations, and the stories we tell ourselves, and in that reflection we discover the patterns that keep us locked in the illusion of separation, your full attention. And we begin to see that transformation is not a matter of fixing those patterns, but of seeing them clearly and allowing them to dissolve. And this dissolution opens the way for a new way of living, one that is rooted in presence, openness, and trust. And this way of living transforms not only our own lives but the way we relate to others. your full attention, because when we are transformed, we no longer see ourselves as separate from others, but as interconnected expressions of life. This interconnectedness brings compassion, empathy, and a deeper sense of belonging. And these qualities are essential to the work of transformation, because transformation is not a solitary process, but a shared one, unfolding in relationship. And relationship becomes the mirror in which we see ourselves more clearly. And in that seeing we awaken to the truth that transformation is not something we do alone, but something that life does through us. And this awakening transforms our understanding of life itself, because we come to see that the purpose of transformation is not to escape who we are, but to awaken to who we already are. This awakening is the essence of freedom, your full attention, because it releases us from the need to become something other than ourselves, and allows us to rest in the fullness of our own being. And resting in that fullness is the deepest form of transformation, because it dissolves the struggle and reveals that transformation has always been present, that it is not a goal to be reached, but a natural unfolding of life when we are willing to live with openness, presence, and trust. And so transformation becomes the art of living, the art of being fully present with ourselves and with life. And in that presence there is a profound peace, a peace that is not the absence of change, but the embrace of it. And in that embrace we discover that the journey of transformation is not about becoming perfect, but about becoming awake. And in awakening we become free to live fully, deeply, and joyfully in the truth of who we are. And this is the living wisdom of transformation, that it is not something to be achieved, but something to be realized, moment by moment, as we allow life to guide us into the fullness of our own being. True transformation is not an event or a sudden achievement, but a continuous process that unfolds over a lifetime. This process requires a radical shift in how we perceive ourselves, because we have been conditioned to think of transformation as a matter of changing who we are into something better, when in reality it is a matter of uncovering who we already are beneath the layers of expectation, fear, and conditioning. These layers are so deeply woven into our sense of self that they often go unnoticed, shaping our thoughts, emotions, actions without our conscious awareness. The first step toward transformation is awareness. The ability to see clearly the patterns that have shaped our lives, the beliefs that keep us limited, and the stories we tell ourselves that maintain the illusion of separation. And this seeing requires courage, because it means facing aspects of ourselves we would rather avoid, aspects we have hidden or denied. Yet, it is precisely in this facing that transformation begins, because transformation is not about rejecting what we find within, but about accepting it fully so that it can be transmuted. And acceptance does not mean resignation. It means being willing to meet reality exactly as it is without resistance. In that meeting there is a release of tension, a letting go of the struggle that has kept us bound to the false self. And as we let go, something deeper emerges, a sense of presence that is not dependent on circumstances, but grounded in the simple awareness of being alive. This presence transforms everything, because it changes our relationship to ourselves and to the world, allowing us to respond to life with clarity rather than reactivity. And this clarity is the fruit of a deep inner work that moves beyond technique or willpower into the realm of insight and understanding, because true transformation is rooted not in forcing change, but in creating the conditions for change to arise naturally. These conditions are cultivated through practices of mindfulness, self-inquiry, and openness, because they train the mind to rest in awareness and the heart to rest in acceptance. And in resting in this way, we begin to see that transformation is not about adding something to ourselves, but about letting go of what is not true, so that what is true can shine forth. This letting go is not a one-time act, but a continual process of shedding layers of conditioning as they arise. Each layer we shed brings us closer to the essence of who we are, and this essence is not fixed but living, unfolding moment by moment. And transformation is the living expression of that unfolding, because it is the art of aligning ourselves with the flow of life, rather than resisting it. This alignment transforms the way we live, because it changes our priorities, our values, and our understanding of what matters, and it teaches us that transformation is not about achieving a particular state, but about learning to live with presence, courage, and compassion in whatever state we find ourselves. And this learning is the heart of the wisdom of transformation, because it shows us that there is no final destination, but only the unfolding journey of becoming. And in this journey, we begin to see that our challenges, your attention, struggles and failures are not obstacles to transformation, but essential parts of it, because they provide the soil in which transformation takes root. And when we meet them with openness, rather than resistance, they become opportunities for awakening, and awakening is the deepest form of transformation, because it is the recognition that we are not separate from life, but life itself. And that transformation is not something we do, but something that life does through us, when we are willing to let go of control and surrender to the flow of existence. And surrender is not passivity, but a conscious choice to trust the unfolding of life, even when the path is unclear. This trust transforms our experience of uncertainty, turning it from a source of fear into a doorway of growth. And in that growth, we discover that transformation is not about perfecting ourselves, but about living with authenticity and presence. And authenticity comes when we stop hiding behind masks and start living in harmony with our true nature. And living in harmony is the essence of transformation, because it brings us into alignment with the deeper truth of who we are. In that alignment there is a profound peace, a peace that is not dependent on external conditions, but arises from the inner certainty that we are living in accordance with the flow of life, and this certainty transforms not only our own lives, but the way we relate to others, because it dissolves the barriers of fear and separation and opens the heart to compassion, empathy, and connection. And these qualities are the living proof that transformation is not a solitary achievement, but a shared process. Because awakening transforms not only the individual, but the world around them. And this is the deeper meaning of transformation, that it is not an act of self-improvement, but a deep remembering of who we are, and how we belong to the whole of existence. And remembering this changes everything, because it frees us from the need to constantly fix ourselves, and allows us to rest in the fullness of our own being. And in that rest we discover that transformation is not something to be completed, but a way of living, a way of being fully present, fully alive, and fully open to the mystery of life. And this way of living is the gift of transformation. The living wisdom that teaches us that to transform is not to escape life, but to embrace it with all of its beauty, uncertainty, and impermanence. In that embrace we find not only change but freedom, peace, the deep joy of living fully in the truth of who we are. The journey of transformation reaches its deepest meaning when we understand that it is not an act of fixing or changing ourselves into something new, but a process of awakening to the truth that we are already whole. This awakening requires that we move beyond the endless striving and self-criticism that has dominated much of our inner life, because the habit of trying to fix ourselves creates a sense of inadequacy that keeps us trapped in a cycle of self-judgment and frustration. And so the final step in transformation is to release the belief that we are broken and in need of repair, instead to cultivate the deep recognition that transformation is a matter of allowing, not forcing, a matter of discovering what is already present rather than constructing something artificial. And this allowing begins with presence, the willingness to be here fully, without distraction or resistance, in whatever state we find ourselves, because transformation is not something to be achieved in the future, but something that unfolds in the present moment when we stop avoiding what is and start living in acceptance of what is. And this acceptance does not mean passivity, it means embracing life with openness and courage, even in the face of uncertainty, pain, and change. And when we embrace life in this way, we discover that transformation is not a destination, but a living reality that reveals itself moment by moment, breath by breath, in every choice we make. And these choices matter, because they form the fabric of how we live and who we become. When our choices are grounded in awareness and openness, they lead us toward a deeper alignment with the flow of life, and to end this alignment is the heart of transformation, because it dissolves the tension between who we think we should be and who we already are. And in that dissolution there is liberation, the liberation from striving, resistance, and the need for control. And in that liberation there is a profound peace, because we come to rest in the truth that life itself is the teacher of transformation, and life offers each of us the opportunities for growth in every moment, through challenges, joys, losses, and encounters. When we open ourselves to life in this way, we begin to understand that transformation is not separate from living, it is living fully and deeply, with all of its uncertainties and wonders. And this understanding changes everything, because it shifts the focus from achieving transformation to living transformation, and living transformation means living with awareness, openness, and trust. And these qualities are cultivated through the practice of presence, which trains the mind to rest in clarity and the heart to rest in acceptance. As we cultivate presence, we begin to see that transformation is not a linear process, but a spiral, a continual deepening of awareness and being. Each step we take in awareness leads us to new insights and new openings. And these openings invite us into deeper levels of presence and acceptance. This spiral of transformation is endless, because life itself is endless, always unfolding in ways that cannot be fully predicted or controlled. In accepting this, we move beyond the illusion of a final destination and enter into the living truth that transformation is not about arriving somewhere, but about embracing the journey itself. The journey of transformation is not a solitary path, but a shared one, because transformation arises in relationship, in the meeting of ourselves with others, and in that meeting we discover the interconnectedness of all life. This interconnectedness is the living proof that transformation is not only personal but collective, your full attention, and that our awakening has the power to awaken others, not through teaching or convincing, but through the simple presence of a transformed life. Because transformation is a vibration, a way of being that resonates and influences those around us. And this influence is not forced, but natural, because when we live transformation we embody a truth that is felt more deeply than words, and this embodiment is the deepest gift of transformation, and the living proof that it is possible to awaken to the fullness of who we are. And in that awakening there is freedom. Freedom not as a concept, but as a living reality, the freedom to live without fear of who we are, the freedom to embrace life in all its richness and mystery. And this freedom transforms the way we engage with the world, because it dissolves the need to control and opens us to the beauty of surrender. Surrender is not giving up, but giving in. Giving ourselves over to the flow of life, trusting that life will lead us where we need to be, even when the path is unclear, and in that trust there is peace, and in that peace there is joy, and this joy is not dependent on external conditions, but arises naturally when we live in alignment with the truth of our own being. And this is the culmination of transformation, the living realization that transformation has never been about becoming someone else, but about awakening to who we already are. And who we are is not a fixed identity, but a living presence, unfolding in every moment. And this presence is the gift that transformation offers, the living awareness that allows us to move through life with openness, compassion, and grace. In that movement we find that transformation is not an achievement to be earned, but a living reality to be embraced, moment by moment, breath by breath, as we allow life to be the teacher, and ourselves to be the student. This is the wisdom of transformation, that it is not something to be fixed or completed, but a way of living fully, freely, and authentically in the truth of who we are, and in that living there is no end, only the endless unfolding of presence, awareness, and love.